Well, today we have a video with a bit of a difference. I've wanted to do this for a while, and because I've recently been selling some vinyl on eBay because I just have so much, I decided that maybe I'd dig out my soundtrack albums and take a look with you at my SF fantasy and horror soundtrack vinyl. Now, it's not a massive collection, but it does go right the way back to my youth, to the 1970s, and I thought I'd share some of this with you because it's the iconography is what people really like about vinyl, the 12-inch square of the sleeve and the beauty of the thing in itself. I actually prefer CD as a listening medium. I think it's far more reliable. I think it's better quality. I don't really go into a debate about that. There's plenty of that on YouTube if you like it, but I still love vinyl because I grew up with it. So I just thought I'd talk through some of the soundtrack albums which were the foundation of my sort of musical taste, really, because I was a soundtrack guy before I was a rock and roll guy, really. And here we have a couple of things which go right the way back to those days in the mid-70s. And on the left, The Changes here. This is a recent reissue of the Radiophonic Workshop. Paddy Kingsland composed music for The Changes, which of course was based on the trilogy by Peter Dickinson. Now, if you've never read Peter Dickinson, he was fundamentally a children's writer. He only wrote one adult SF novel, The Green Gene, which is a very good satirical SF novel. And The Changes is an interesting trilogy because the first one that was published, The Weathermonger, is actually the third book in terms of internal chronology. So it's the end of the story. And then the two later books, which were published after that, Heartsease and The Devil's Children. So they're out of chronology. So you get the end of the story first, then you get the middle of the story, and then you get the beginning of it. But of course, what happened when the TV series was made, it was filmed chronologically. And there are different children who are focuses in each of the books. But in the TV series, it's one child. And it's an interesting thing. It was a big thing when I was a kid, and I really enjoyed it. You watch it as an adult, and it's very, very slow, and it takes a long time to unfold. But I would say if you haven't read The Weathermonger, particularly do, because it's fantastic. The basic idea behind the novels and the series was that for some reason people all turn against technology and start smashing up machinery, and they get very confused, and it's almost as if there's this strange noise in the air that's making them do this. And the reason for it is just incredible when you read the novel. It's just absolutely amazing. The Weathermonger is an amazing book. And it doesn't come across quite as clearly in the TV adaptation. It's very, very strange, and it is worth a look. I would say just watch the beginning and watch the end. The rest isn't so great. So this was, I say, was issued a few years ago. The music is great. It's really good electronic stuff. It's fantastic. So if you like electronica, it is something worth picking up. I don't think there's a CD of it. You can download it. I think this came with a free download, and that's how I've tended to listen to it. The LP on the left was a really big thing for me as a kid. And this is the Music for Pleasure label. So it's not the actual original soundtracks. These are cover versions by Jeff Love and his orchestra. And Jeff Love used to work for the BBC. And they are rehashings of themes from what are described here as big terror movie themes. And it's interesting looking at this because there's hardly any actual horror films in the supernatural sense here. We are talking about other sorts of things. There's even some SF covered. There's also disaster movies and animals gone wild things, as you see from the old Great White there. And it is an interesting reflection of what was happening in cinema in the mid-70s. And I got this from the Carrefour hypermarket in Caerphilly, which was a huge supermarket. And this would have been about 73, 74, maybe a little bit later, because I'm looking here and I think the newest films on here are Rollerball and Jaws. So that says 75 to me. Yeah, in April 75. So 75. So I'm about 12 when this came out. And I played and played and played this album. And it's interesting because some of the things on it, I mean, if you look through the rundown of tracks, Airport 75 is one of the sort of definitive disaster movies. Obviously, so is Fly and Inferno, so is Poseidon Adventure. The Eiger Sanction is a thriller with Clint Eastwood. 3 Days of the Condor is a thriller. The Executioner is a kind of crime film. It's quite an obscure one. Jaws, of course, you know. Earthquake, another definitive disaster movie. Rollerball is an actual SF film. The Exorcist, an actual supernatural fantasy horror film. Death Wish is a thriller, and Psycho, again, you could say it's a horror film, but of course it's a crime film and it's based on something that actually happened, the Ed Gein case. So you see all the iconography of these films here. And at that time, of course, there was no sort of VHS or home video. So you would buy tie-in novels, you would buy soundtracks, and you would imagine yourself into the movies. And if you were lucky, you would get in to see them. And I think I've seen all these films now. At that time, I'd seen hardly any of them. I'd seen Jaws and Earthquake, and it was the disaster movies. And that shows you how big the disaster movie was. Is the disaster a kind of SF movie? Not really. It's got the same sort of relationship, I guess, to SF cinema as the techno thriller does to the SF novel. It's an interesting one, and this has seen a lot of action over the years, and it's in a bit of a state, but yeah, this was great, and these were really successful because they were very, very cheap indeed. Next to that, of course, we have the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy album with the Don't Panic thing there. This again is a reissue. I did have the original one, and of all the different versions, of course, there's the radio version, the novels. This is actually my favorite version. It's really, really good, and it has some different actors to it, the ones which appeared in the TV series later. Some of the same ones, but the fact is, because this is entirely sort of voice effects and music driven, the acting is so good and the actors really deliver the lines really well. So for me, it's the definitive version. Here's the interior of the gatefold, and what you're seeing here is this is actually what was originally two different LPs brought together. There's the original Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, which was a double album, and there was a second single disc album, The Restaurant, The End of the Universe, and that's what's represented here with the rubber duck in the bath. And in this reissue, which I think was a Record Store Day reissue, and this is for 3 or 4 years ago, they brought the two together, because I didn't have my original anymore, which I still had it, because the gatefold for the original Hitchhiker's album was much, much nicer than this. So that's the rear of the sleeve, but of course that would have been the front of the original Restaurant at the End of the Universe LP. So if you've still got those, well done. And of course the discs themselves are on very fetching coloured vinyl, and you can actually get this on CD. I've got it in a fat pack. I love fat pack CDs. I'm a real jewel case guy. I can't stand digipacks. And yeah, so I bought these as well because, you know, it does take you back, and the sleeve is really beautiful, an early example of digital design there, which is really, really nice. And I think what they've done, they've squeezed it. Is it actually 3 LPs? I'm not sure. They've squeezed it onto let's see, yeah, I think it is. They squeezed it onto several discs. I think it's a triple album. There's a purple one there with a plug hole, you know, and what have you, all that Adams type iconography. I'm not a massive Douglas Adams fan, I must say. I do like Hitchhikers. I like the first 2 books. After that, I think he really sort of loses it. But I can't really forgive him for sort of really ripping off Sheckley so badly. And people say that he didn't, that he never read Sheckley till afterwards. But I just don't believe it. The coincidences are too great. So now we come on to the individual proper soundtrack albums themselves. And I decided to do this A to Z by film title. I could have gone chronological, but I thought this is how they've come off the racking in my house, and I thought I'd just take you through it. And just beginning on the left there, again, not really a science fiction film, but the disaster movie was an interesting thing that sort of cut into horror at the time because it was so real world. And in a way, you can see it almost as a precursor of the terrible terrorist-dominated times we have now. And arguably the first disaster movie would be Airport, based on the novel by Arthur Haley in the 1960s, which is about a crisis set around an airport and a plane that's in difficulty. And of course, there were several sequels of diminishing quality. But because I was 12 in 1975, going to the cinema a lot, and it was that period where I started with cinema on my own and things, you know, they were important films to me. And this is the soundtrack, as you see, of Airport 1975, which is, I think there's a terrorist subplot. I've got it on DVD. I haven't watched it for years and years and years. And a small plane crashes into a 747. And of course, you get this beautiful artwork which you don't get now on film posters. So it'd be reproduced across the poster and all the advertising, the soundtrack album. If there was a tie-in novel, I'm not sure if there was a tie-in novel of April 75. Perhaps somebody can sort of write that in. So, but it was sort of great stuff. And as I say, the Jeff Love album had a lot of these things that are the main themes of the disaster movies, and that led me on to collect some of the actual proper soundtrack albums. And I only bought this about 20 years ago. I bought it still sealed. It's got a saw cut there, which means it was a remainder, so it was unplayed when I got it. And the music is by somebody called John Kakavas. And you know, it's great stuff, and he's a very much sort of John Williams light, and it's got a marvelous little sort of liner note by Telly Savalas, who goes on about how talented John Kakavas is, and he says he no longer needs me and I hate him, which is really funny. And it's got this sort of paste down effect there, where that was pasted down on the back, and you see that on older LPs, and it would just take you back to those days. So the iconography is all there, and you know, it's on the MCA label, you know, which is not a label one thinks of very much in terms of rock and roll. So, you know, it is quite nice to look at the iconography of those sort of things as well. So that was good. And then Charlton Heston was in this one. Charlton Heston was somebody I saw a lot in the cinema in my youth. He was in things like Ben-Hur and the Ten Commandments, which were reissued when I was a kid, biblical epics, and they had massive impact on me. Then, of course, there's Planet of the Apes, which was the first live action science fiction film I saw at the cinema. Next to that, we have James Horner's soundtrack for Aliens, more conventional sort of thing with an orchestra, strings and what have you. And you know, Aliens, I still really like Aliens. I think what I like about it is it represents probably the best example of a pure hard SF story on screen, really. And it is simple. It doesn't have the same visceral primal power of the first one, but it's still a cracking film, and easily, for my money, the best thing that James Cameron ever did. The original Aliens album is really quite hard to get, and you know, you can get it on CD, but you can't get a dual case, and it just doesn't have the same feel when it's in a digipack. And it's high time the album was reissued as well, really. I've also got this on cassette for some bizarre reason. You know, it's a nice score, it really is. But it's interesting, the film soundtrack now has disappeared down a rabbit hole where everything sounds the same. And I think Horner's one of the people who influenced people like Danny Elfman. And I would say Elfman is the beginning of the end of the sort of traditional soundtrack, where you've got this cod Gothic, cod Wagnerian thing, this all bombast, but very little actual melody. And, you know, there are some great melodies in that. Just to look on the rear of the sleeve there, you've got some cracking stills there, especially Ripley there. You know, what can you say? Absolutely fantastic sequence where she takes the alien queen on. It's wonderful. We all love it, really. And next to that, we have Christine. Again, this is a fairly recent reissue of the Christine soundtrack. And Christine was on TV the other night. I started watching. I think, why am I watching it? I've got a Blu-ray. But of course, Christine's quite controversial in a way, because of course, there's a story by Keith Roberts called The Scarlet Lady, which was published way back in the early 60s. I think it was an Impulse, which is about a red car that throughout its existence kills people, and it's far subtler and far shorter than the King story. It's probably about 12 or 15 pages, and it's collected in a collection called Winterwood, published by Morrigan. My friend Les Escott published that back in the late 80s, early 90s. And it's this sort of matter-of-fact telling in the voice of a mechanic about this car. I think it's a mechanic, and how, you know, it sort of like falls off the engine block and breaks people's legs and stuff like that. And it's far subtler than Christine, but several people have picked up on it. When I first read the story, I thought, gosh, I wonder if King read this back in the 60s, because it seems so obvious, because Christine is red, of course, as well. But it's a cracking film. It's John Carpenter, good music. Christine the novel rather does outstay its welcome. It's enormously long. I remember reading it back in the 80s. It's something like 600 to 800 pages long, and it just goes on and on and on. So if you read the Keith Roberts story, The Scarlet Lady, as I say, it's an oldest of Impulse, I think, and it's in Winterwood and Other Hauntings. It really is an example of how a great piece of literature, in the basic idea in another hand, is turned into something which is hugely successful and popular, but nowhere near as good. But it's a great soundtrack, and it's a fun film, it has to be said. Aliens and Christine were, of course, staples of 1980s genre cinema, but here we go back to the 70s to a fantastic SF film, one of the greatest SF films, not by a genre director, or can you say he was? Well, he did a lot of genre work, and he did loads of things based on books. He loved making films based on books, and that was his key thing, and he did that pretty much from the beginning. Only a few of the early things are not based on books, and even then he collaborated with writers. And this is two variants of the Clockwork Orange score, and you notice neither of them say A Clockwork Orange, and of course A Clockwork Orange is the correct title. And this one here on the left is my original copy, and this was everywhere in the 70s and 80s. Everybody had it. Everybody you knew who's a punk rock or interested in alternative music had it, and it's a combination of electronic realizations of classical themes by Walter Carlos. Walter Carlos was a pioneer of the Moog synthesizer. Of course, it's Moog, really, Bob Moog. So we all say Moog because we like the sound of it, and that's how it looks when it's written, M-O-O-G, but it's the Moog, really. So he worked with Bob Moog, and fundamentally they sort of built this huge modular synth, and it was recorded monophonically, one line at a time, no chords. And Carlos did these wonderful realizations of works by Beethoven, Purcell, and what have you. And, you know, if you love the novel, which I did, it's a fantastic soundtrack. And when I bought this, you know, you couldn't see the film. The film was withdrawn in the UK. It wasn't banned. It was never banned. Kubrick withdrew it. You couldn't see it. So I managed to get a really rough bootleg VHS, which got loaned around everybody and what have you. And, you know, it's a really amazingly good soundtrack because you do sort of really get into the classical music in it, and there's some original themes as well. Now, on the right is the full-blown electronic version. So it's just the Walter Carlos ones. On the white one, there are some recordings from Deutsche Grammophon and other labels of actual classical pieces performed by orchestras rather than electronic realizations. But on the album on the right, this is Carlos's complete recordings for the film, more or less. So there are things on there, like there's a wonderful track called Country Lane, which isn't in the film, and it depicts the moment when Alex is taken off down a country lane by his former droogs, Pete and Georgie. Is it Pete and Georgie? No, it's Dim and Georgie, isn't it? And they basically sort of, they're cops at this point, and they beat him up and leave him for Mr. Alexander to discover. So you see there down in the corner, there's a sticker there with Anthony Burgess' signature on. Now, that technically is a book plate. I did meet Burgess shortly after this, but when I was running a signed first editions club for a major book selling company, we used to do this thing where we would order, we'd have catalogue, it would go out, it would say these are books which are coming out next 2 months, place your orders by this date, and we get signed copies. And usually they were directly signed. There was the odd case where we had to have book plates. And Burgess used to travel a lot. He didn't spend a lot of time in the UK for tax reasons. He hated paying absurd amounts of tax, which he had to pay because he was successful. He used to travel around a lot, around Europe particularly. So that was a spare I had, so I managed to pop that on there. And I think I did it with this one as well. Yeah, there you go. So you can see just there. There we are. So these ones, I can actually remember buying these albums. I bought this one from a classical music shop in Cardiff in the corridor, which is no longer there. It hasn't been there for a very long time. And it was a really good little classical record shop. And I think I got the other one there as well. I can't recall. But if you've never heard it, it's a wonderful soundtrack, really, really good. And if you love electronic music, it's fantastic. And there's echoes of DC Ray, The Day of Wrath, in the funeral music for Queen Mary, which is the opening music, which Kubrick then referred to. He got Carlos in again, and you can't get the soundtrack The Shining, which drives me mad. It's ridiculous. The Shining soundtrack's brilliant, and there's things like Bartok on it. There's a lot of Carlos. There's an amazing version of DC Ray, Day of Wrath, and that's quoted in the Purcell piece by Carlos on both of these, which is fantastic. And you know, if you don't know Clockwork Orange, you've never read it, never seen it, you really must. It's one of the greatest science fiction films, one of the greatest science fiction novels, and one of the greatest science fiction soundtracks of all time. Back to the 1980s and two of the greatest cult movies of that period. On the left we have the soundtrack of The Company of Wolves, based on the stories The Company of Wolves and Wolf Alice by Angela Carter from her collection The Bloody Chamber, the wonderful postmodern retelling of fairy tales, bringing all the Freudian impulses right up to the surface. Music composed and conducted by George Fenton. There's some synth music on there as well. It's mostly based on little violin motifs which is sort of quite folky. And if you've never seen Company of Wolves, it's a wonderful sort of frame narrative thing. It's about a young girl who's having these dreams. They've just moved to a new house, and she's a very, very beautiful girl, and she has these wonderful dreams, and they're all dreams of wolves, and it's obviously about her emergent sexuality. And it's a great, great film, and Carter's involved. And I remember vividly seeing it in the cinema in 1984. I just started book selling, and there was a tie-in edition which had a version of this on the cover, which you don't see very often. There's a pictorial one as well. I think the one with this was actually for the USA, and the pictorial one, which still some of the film, I used to have that, and it's long gone. That's my first copy of The Bloody Chamber. I've got a Gollancz hardcover. And yeah, this is great stuff. If you've never seen this, it's one of the wonderful sort of werewolf films, and it's different to all the others because it is very fabula and fairy tale based, and some wonderful stills there. So do check that if you've never seen it. On the right, we have the amazing Contamination by Goblin. Now, Contamination is that great thing. It's a classic example of the good bad film, and Contamination is an Italian movie which was directed by Luigi Cozzi. On the screen, he's credited as Lewis Coates if you see the UK-US version, because, you know, they thought it's got to be somebody American. You put an American name on, and Italians are more likely to go and see it. And Contamination is sort of, how can I describe it? It had different titles. It's called something like Astro or something in Germany, and there was a film called Alien 2 on Earth, and it's not a very good film. It takes place in a cavern, and it's got this terrible sort of dialogue and exposition. Contamination basically starts exactly the same way as Zombie Flesh Eaters, with a ship coming into port in New York, and it's beautifully filmed. And on the ship there are these strange green eggs which explode, and they spatter all over people, and then they explode, rather like the chest burster sequence in Alien. And there are references throughout Contamination to all sorts of science fiction films, particularly the climax of Invaders of Mars, and Invaders from Mars, I should say. Not a great 50s SF film, and there's a terrible remake by Tobe Hooper. But it really is good, and it's got Ian McCulloch from Survivors. But the best thing about it by far is the amazing soundtrack by Goblin, the Italian prog rockers, who specialised in horror and SF soundtracks. And it's got this wonderful theme called Connection, which has this pulsing bass line and these heavy keyboards over it. It just builds and builds. And it's just absolutely wonderful. So, you know, if you can get to see it, do it. It's a great, fun, schlocky B-movie. Correct me if I'm wrong, film fans, but I think there was a point where it ended up on the Video Nasties list, and I think McCulloch himself said in an interview he thought this was ridiculous, because he said it's just a fantasy film, it's not realistic at all, you know, nothing in it would ever actually happen. Or was that Luigi Cozzi said that? I think it was Luigi Cozzi said that. Cozzi always seems like a heck of a nice guy, worked with Dario Argento a lot. He made Star Crash with Caroline Munro, which is a classic Italian Star Wars ripoff, which is virtually unwatchable, though you do watch it for Caroline Munro. Politically incorrect, I know, but I don't really care. But yeah, if you ever get the chance to see Contamination, do. There's an Arrow Blu-ray of it, which is fantastic, and you know, it's worth getting for the music alone. And I think, can you get the soundtrack album? I've got 2 different CDs of it and this, and it is fantastic. And Goblin are brilliant, but there's been all sorts of reissues of compilations, and if you can, try and get the actual original soundtracks, because they're much, much better. And we flip back again to the 1970s, and here we are with 2 very old LPs that take me way, way back to a misspent youth. And on the left there, that's the soundtrack of Profondo Rosso, better known in the UK as Deep Red, also known in some territories as Suspiria II or Axe Murders. And Deep Red was made in Italy in 1975 with David Hemmings, and it's a fantastic giallo. That's Italian for yellow, and that means basically an Italian slasher movie. But of course with Argento they have this very operatic style. Prog music by Goblin. This was the first time Goblin worked with Argento. They worked with him quite a bit, and this is the definitive lineup of Claudio Simonetti on keyboards, Agostino Maragloni on drums. I'm pronouncing that completely incorrectly, sorry Agostino. And then there's Massimo Morante on guitar, who sadly passed on about a year ago. and the very wonderful Fabio Pinatelli on bass, wonderful bass player, but John Wetton. And Goblin were influenced by sort of British prog rock. You can hear bits of King Crimson in them, little bits of Yes, even bits of Mike Oldfield, and absolutely just fantastic stuff. And Deep Red is a great sort of murder mystery with sort of gore and all sorts of secrets and wonderful Italian settings. You've never seen it. And I bought this was actually bought by me in the early 80s, and this was from it's on the Cinevox label, Italian label, and it's seen a lot of action, this LP, I can tell you now. Look at that. Good grief, that takes me back a bit. And I managed to get the first Goblin album I had was Suspiria, which I'll show you later on, but I got this from a shop in London which was then called Dress Circle, and Dress Circle was in Covent Garden, and it was a small 2-floor specialist soundtrack and musicals LP shop. And the first time I ever went to London, I got a National Express coach up from Pontypridd in South Wales, armed with some money, and I bought about 5 Goblin albums. I bought a couple of other things as well, and they were pretty expensive. They were a good sort of 15-20 quid a piece, and in those days an LP was about £5, so they really were expensive. The shop later moved. They had their own label. They was retitled That's Entertainment. The shop moved to, I seem to remember it was Charing Cross Road, or maybe just off that. It was in somewhere in Soho, I think. And they moved into CDs, and it wasn't as good, but it was a fantastic thing and great stuff. The theme tune, the single Deep Red, did really well in Italy. It was a huge hit, and I think it went to #1. I think it was their biggest hit. They had a number of hits. So their hits were basically, even though they did an album under the name Cherry 5 for singing on, and they did another album called, I can't say what the title is in Italian, but it translates as The Fantastic Adventures of Mark the Cockroach, believe it or not. You know, their hits were really all sort of soundtracks from horror movies, you know. And the thing is in Italy, Argento, the director and screenwriter, was really famous. He and Dario Nicolodi, his partner at that time, and they are charred as Asia Argento, who's quite internationally famous now. You probably know Asia's name and face. She's acted in all sorts of things. Very interesting lady. And yeah, you know, they were really famous. They were in the late 70s, early 80s. They were as famous in Italy as Posh and Becks used to be in the UK, which tells you something. The other album, of course, is the soundtrack of Earthquake by John Williams. And I used to have the quad poster of that with the Earthquake lettering and pictures of all the stars up on my wall as a teenager. I got that from the Castle Cinema in Caerphilly, where I used to go all the time. When I was about 12 to 15, I'd go there all the time, and the Sex Pistols played there. I didn't get to see them, sadly. I was around the corner at my auntie's and I had no idea what was going on. I was a bit too young for punk rock, but the following year, boy, I was there. And yeah, you know, this is great stuff. And this is with John Williams when he was really good, you know. It's before Star Wars. I think from Star Wars on, I don't think he's as good. He's more commercial. There's more subtle jazz influences, piano and stuff. Lots of drama. And Earthquake, of course, was probably the original disaster movie. I mean, there weren't many of them, but Earthquake was released before Towering Inferno in the USA. And in the UK it was different. It came afterwards. Of course, it had Charlton Heston in it again, one of my idols. And I know people have a go at Charlton because of his National Rifle Association thing, but it's a great movie. It's got a great cast in it, and you know, it pioneered sense around sound, which was that the speakers would make it feel like the cinema was shaking. And a great cast there on the back: Charlton Heston on the top left there, George Kennedy, Richard Roundtree, great blaxploitation actor, very handsome man. You know, the girls just go mad for Richard, and he plays a sort of a Evel Knievel type character in it. Lorne Greene, and you know, people like Victoria Principal down there, who was later to find fame in Dallas, and Ava Gardner and Genevieve Bujold, who later worked with David Cronenberg in Dead Ringers. And yeah, you know, this was sort of iconic stuff when I was a kid. Now a well-worn hit and a controversial one. On the left there is a soundtrack for a film which really divides people, and as you can see, it's Exorcist II, The Heretic, with a very wonderful and toothsome Linda Blair. And there are two types of people in the world. There's a very small number of us who love The Heretic, and there's the mass who hate it, because of course what people want from a sequel, what the masses want from a sequel to a famous film, is the same thing over again. And what John Boorman did for us in Exorcist II, and Boorman, you know, he's got his bad side. You know, there are some excesses and things, but you know, if you look at Zardos, for example, look at the Emerald Forest, but there's good things as well. And even though it suffered from terrible editing, some dreadful overacting by a Richard Burton who was sort of getting beyond it. It was one of Burton's last films. It really is a fantastic film, and there is an argument that in some ways The Heretic is more like a science fiction film because it looks at why Regan is possessed by Pazuzu, the Assyrian wind demon of The Exorcist. And it's got some beautiful stuff in it. And of course, the score's by Morricone. So it's got some wonderful ethereal, spiritual theme to it, which is absolutely gorgeous. And then it's got things with electric guitars and whips and what have you, all that odd stuff. I mean, he was the master arranger. Nobody arranges like Morricone. He would do things that nobody else would do in his strange jazzy scores for early Argento films, for his famous spaghetti westerns, which have everything from whistling to Jew harps to all sorts of stuff. You know, it's just incredible. This is a lovely soundtrack, and it really does sort of make you think. It's got African elements in it. It's fantastic stuff, and I personally love The Heretic. I think it's great because it sets out to try and explain why Regan is invaded by the spirit. And even though there are 3 or 4 different cuts in it, and I've seen them all, and there isn't a definitive version, it needs a definitive version. The problem is that nobody loves it enough to put one together, and that's a great shame, because I think a definitive version could be cut together that would be a lot better, and that could erase some of the excesses that Borman couldn't quite sort of filter out. Great shame, really, but wonderful soundtrack. So do check out the soundtrack, even if you can't be bothered with the film. But I would say give the film another viewing and look at it from a rationalist point of view, because it's excellent. Then, of course, we have a remake, The Fly, the David Cronenberg version, with music by Howard Shore, who of course worked with Cronenberg for many, many years, and has done some wonderful tragic scores, both in terms of orchestral and electronic. Think of the wonderful creeping synth score of Videodrome, the piercing electric guitar, harp and very steely score of Crash, which is absolutely amazing, one of my favourite soundtracks. And this really was Cronenberg's breakthrough moment. This was his big hit. The Fly, of course, was based on a story by George Langella from the late 50s. And of course, there's the original film version and its 2 sequels. The original film had Vincent Price, and it's a great fun film. But of course, this one took it a lot further. Be afraid, be very afraid. And you know, what can you say? A fantastic score for a fantastic movie. This is a fairly recent LP reissue of The Fly. And as you see, it's on bottle green vinyl, so which is sort of clear, but it's not as dull as plain clear vinyl. I do like the Rykodisc style bottle green, and there's some stills from the film on the back. Then of course Jeff Goldblum was going out with Gina Davis at that time. They're both very quirky, and they had a relationship going on. Of course, in the film their characters have one, and it's utterly tragic, and absolutely brilliant special effects, of course, and those wonderful moments of Cronenberg dialogue which mark him as the world's greatest science fiction director. Things about insect politics and, you know, I was an insect who dreamt he was a man, all those things, which are just absolutely fantastic. And he brings that literary sensibility into film. And it shows that it's the dialogue that really makes it on top of the visuals and the music and everything else. The wonderful artistry of the team that Cronenberg arranged around himself. He tended to use a lot of the same people, same cinematographer, same set designer. He did that a lot. He had his own little sort of company of people. And of course, he was Canadian, so there's a different sensibility there. And he was a literary guy, you know. He writes most of his films and original ideas. And when he takes on somebody else's thing, he twists it and makes it his own. So fantastic stuff, and a great score from Howard Shore. More horror, and there, of course, on the left, we have The Fog. Again, a recent reissue on green vinyl. And what can we say about The Fog? Well, it's a classic Jamesian ghost story, isn't it? It's wonderful, atmospheric, takes place in a beautiful seaside town in California. It has a cast of genre favourites from Adrienne Barbeau, who was then, I believe, Carpenter's good lady. It has John Houseman at the beginning telling the children the story. I say very Jamesian, very M.R. James. He's telling the story of what happened 100 years before, and we have, of course, the sort of wonderful sea zombies coming back to claim their vengeance. And you know, it's a cracking film, and you know, we need more great traditional ghost story filmmaking like this. And you know, with the wonderful creeping electronic pulse and the subtle piano and the uncluttered nature of Carpenter's scoring, it really is quite something. Fantastic stuff. And then next to that, again, we have the sort of old animal exploitation thing. And Jaws, of course, caused a big splash, and then there were a few imitators coming after that. The one which probably had the biggest sort of impact in the UK was probably Grizzly. That was the first thing to come out. And again, I had the quad of this on my wall when I was a kid, and it used to say something like 18 feet of gut-crunching fury. And Grizzly is a fun film. There was another one about a huge killer bear called Claws, which I have seen, but that didn't have the same distribution. The other ones which hit the UK were Tentacles, which is an Italian film, Tentacole, which has some Hollywood stars in it in Fading Years, and that's about, you know, giant squid or giant octopus. And then of course there's Orca, which was another big one as well. And you know, there were others, but these were the ones which were hits. And you know, Grizzly, what can you say? You know, the bear isn't actually that big, but I think you'd agree in terms of iconography that's pretty special. Now we have a real obscure rarity and something which everybody had, and of course everybody had Jaws. This isn't my original copy, this is a later reissue. I played and played and played this to death, and of course it's got those wonderful creeping themes that we all know, and there's some lyrical stuff as well. And it really is John Williams at, I wouldn't say it's best, I prefer slightly earlier stuff. I prefer scores for Earthquake and the Fly and Inferno, but you know, you can't really go wrong. It's so totally iconic, and you know, wonderful book as well. And the film, I like the film, you know, it is a male bonding movie, it has to be said. And it was quite an experience seeing it at the cinema in 74, 70, 75, I think it was, the first time, you know, and lots of jump scares, and everybody really enjoyed it, and it's great fun. But of course it had a very negative impact on the sharks of the world. People were sort of using it as an excuse to just go and kill them, which was a bad thing. And Peter Benchley put a lot of money into a foundation to sort of educate people about sharks, you know, which are threatened, and it was that was a great thing to do. So if you've never read Jaws, you should. It's very, very powerful, very bleak, and it is a crude book, but it's powerful, and you just come out of with this incredibly bleak view of human existence and how people are just vile, and there's this shark which is just like an eating machine. It's a very powerful book. It's a very existentialist novel in lots of ways, and I don't want to sort of overcook it, but it is worth reading, and it does stay with you. And of course I read it as a kid, and there's lots of things in the book which aren't in the film, you know, because Spielberg just sanitized everything. Of course it's not feel good at all in the book. On the left we have something much scarcer, and as you can see, this is the soundtrack to Inseminoid, with music composed and performed by John Scott, which is a synthesizer score. Now Inseminoid unfairly gets described as an Alien ripoff that was made in the wake of Alien. Well, I've got news for you, it wasn't. Inseminoid was shot, I think, in Chislehurst Caves, where the Hellfire Club used to do their stuff, and basically it was shot at the same time as Alien, but Alien was shot by Fox. It was on a closed sort of studio. It was very, very secret. Nobody knew about it. It was very, very secret indeed. So there's no way that Norman J. Warren, who directed Inseminoid, could have known about it. And it's a very low budget film. It's a fun film. It's got very basic special effects, great synth score, which I do have. You can download it. I downloaded it and burned it onto a CD, because I've only played this LP once, I think. So I try not to play LPs too much, keep them in nice nick. And if you've never seen Inseminoid, it was released after Alien, and it's had a lot of, you know, negative reviews, and it's rather like Contamination in a way, in that it's an exploitation film, but it's a really cracking one. And it says on the back that the instruments that we use include the Prophet 5 synthesizer, which is a great synth. Japan used to use that a lot. Polymoog, Roland CR78 Compirhythm drum machine, a vocoder. Marvelous stuff. And it's got a good cast in it. It's got Stephanie Beacham and Judy Geeson are the sort of key people. And it's about a team of astronauts who are on another planet, and they are doing an archaeological dig, except there is something still alive there. So there is a kind of similarity to that sort of beginning sequence of Alien, and it is about alien reproductive systems that use human beings as hosts. And of course this comes from A. Van Vogt's The Voyage of the Space Beagle, specifically from Black Destroyer, the first part of the book, and then about the third part of the book, Discord in Scarlet. And of course Fox settled out of court for Alien with Van Vogt. He probably could have got something out of this as well, but of course they had no money, these guys. So if you've never seen Inseminoid, do check it out. Another film from that period which also riffs on the alien reproduction thing, but is also quite serious. A film called Xtro, Xtro, by, is it Harry Adam Knight, I think it is. And that's a cracking fun film as well. There's at least 2 versions of that, and there's 2 sequels which are unwatchable. They came much, much later. But do check out Inseminoid and Xtro for some good alien reproductive fun. Is that a genre in itself, we ask ourselves? Then it's time for some matinee entertainment, the sort of thing you want to see on a Saturday afternoon in a flea pit. And yeah, we're going back to the 70s and 60s. Sure, on the left we have a classic dystopia, and on the right a prehistoric fantasy. And just look at the iconography and the artwork of those sleeves. Logan's Run, of course. Music composed and conducted by Joe Goldsmith, and that artwork is just absolutely gorgeous. I'm going to bring it nearer, and variants of this were used on different book editions. There's Michael York there as Logan, and as Jessica we have the very wonderful Jenny Agutter, and of course there's Farrah Fawcett there, and there's Box, remember that moment? Great stuff. And yeah, it's a fun film. In some ways it's terrible, you know, it's full of all sorts of logical inconsistencies and things, but I love Logan's Run. It looks amazing, it sounds great, it really stands up, it's fantastic entertainment. It's not as good as the book. The book, you know, we always say this, don't we? The film's not as good as the book, and it's mostly true, but there are exceptions. And this writing, look at that typeface, brilliant. And it's got a rainbow. I mean, that means something different now, I guess, but there you go. But it's great stuff. And we've all had enormous fun with this. If you've never read the book, do try and get hold of it. It's ridiculous that it's not in print in an accessible edition, and there's 2 sequels, and isn't that beautiful? And it's a lot sharper, and it's more sort of new wavy than people say it is, really. There's even a character in it referred to called Ballard, which is funny enough. And then we have 1 Million Years BC, 1966, a Hammer film with stop motion animation by the wonderful Ray Harryhausen, of course, get the dinosaurs. Raquel Welch, who's sadly no longer with us, as Loana. And of course it was a remake of an earlier film called 1 Million Years BC, which had Victor Mathieu in it. And it was also known as Man and His Mate, I think it was, and that was about 42, 43. But of course this had much better special effects, much better dinosaurs. Raquel was much hotter, and you know, it was filmed on the Canary Islands. It's an amazing looking film. It still stands up even now. And of course there's the 2 quasi sequels, which are When Dinosaurs Ruled the Earth with Victoria Vetri, and then Creatures the World Forgot, which doesn't have any dinosaurs in, which is a bit of a fail because we do like our dinosaurs. And yeah, this is absolutely great, and this is one of those things that you see when you're a kid and it stays with you and you just can't fault it. And look at that. Isn't that beautiful? John Richardson there, who was extremely handsome, and he was quite big for a while, but he sort of faded away. And of course, he has the very wonderful Martine Bezic in it as well. You know, she was a Hammer glamour girl as well, and Martine Bezic was the first woman to appear in 2 Bond films. She was one of the gypsy dancers. Did they have a cat fight? I think they did in From Russia with Love, and she was then Thunderball, one of the dullest films ever made. And these underwater things, they can get a bit boring. So yeah, because of course people think about Maud Adams being in a couple of things, but Bezic was there first. But Raquel, Harryhausen, dinosaurs, what more can you want? Talking about the 80s in cinema, it's often dominated by narratives about youth film, and it's interesting because it depends what age you are, and a lot of my friends are a bit younger than me. They talk about sort of 80s films which are aimed at kids and young people, like Ghostbusters and The Goonies and what have you. And you know, those things sort of passed me by because by then I was doing other things. But there was some really amazing genre cinema in the 80s. And on the left, one of my favourite films, probably my favourite film by John Carpenter, which is Prince of Darkness, which again is, you know, it's a horror film. It is a science fiction film. If you've never seen Prince of Darkness, then you really have not lived. It's a kind of homage to Quatermass. It is even written by Martin Quatermass. It says on the credits, of course it's not, and it says, oh, you know, Martin Quatermass is the brother of the English rocket scientist, but it's all made up, of course. And Prince of Darkness has Alice Cooper in it, in a little role, and it has Donald Pleasance, wonderful cast, and it's about a team of scientists who are assembled in a church to look at this strange cylinder which is in a basement full of this green fluid, which is the essence of evil. And there's all sorts of things about quantum in there and time travel, and it's got wonderful stuff in it. It's really scary. It's got a few sort of schlocky moments which are more like those that you get in a zombie movie, but it is a great film, and it sort of marked the end really of Carpenter's sort of golden period of genre cinema. He'd done such a great job from the beginning with things like Dark Star, written by Dan O'Bannon, who later went on to write Alien. And if you've never seen Dark Star, it's a very Dickian space film. It's very funny. It's kind of, in a way, it's almost like a jokey Barry N. Malzberg film, if you can imagine that. There's not been a Barry N. Malzberg film yet. There is supposedly going to be a film Beyond Apollo, so we shall see, I guess. Then on our right we have The Road Warrior, which most of us in the UK call Mad Max 2. I don't call it Mad Max 2, I call it The Road Warrior because that's a much cooler title. And what did J.G. Ballard say about The Road Warrior? He'd said it was Punk's Sistine Chapel, and I'm just going to bring it closer here because Mad Max was quite successful in the UK, but it didn't do so well in the States. So when of course it's in Australia, the Australian films, and when this was released it was retitled for the US market as The Road Warrior, and it was hugely successful. And look at that artwork, isn't that absolutely fantastic? And there we go, in the back I put a little still. Now that of course is Mel Gibson as Max Rockatansky. What a stupid name, you know, Max Rockatansky. When you have an ordinary name, Rockatansky, it's entirely made up to be cool. Let's see if I can get this out here and show you the rest. And I think I got that from a shop which is no longer around in London. Of course it's not going to come out, that would be too easy. That was a shop, I think maybe it is still there. I've been to London for years. I'm going soon and you'll see what adventures I'm going to have. And that was a shop called Vintage Magazine Company, VinMag, and they were in Soho, and they were there for years and years and years, and they sold magazines and posters and all sorts of stuff. And look at that, it's great. There's Emil Minty as the feral kid. I always love the dog. To me, it's the boy and his dog, Harlan Ellison, isn't it, really? It's boy and his dog on wheels, because these guys are like a rover pack, you know, and he's a solo. That's all it is. It's Ellison on wheels without the telepathy and without the wonderful sort of dialogue. So there you go. But The Road Warrior. And it begins with that absolutely fantastic voiceover. It was a time of chaos, this blighted place. All that stuff. It's just fantastic, isn't it? I could watch that sequence, that info dump. It's one of the best info dumps in SF cinema, where it's delivered and later on you realise that it's the feral kid. Sorry, that's a spoiler, but it is what it is. I'm sure you've all seen Mad Max 2, The Road Warrior anyway. But what a beautiful LP. The music, I always felt it was fairly conventional, but it, you know, it does the job. It sort of pumps along behind the amazing sort of chase sequences. You know, there's no CGI in it. There's no CGI then. It was all real stunts. So it's got the element of real danger, the wonderful costumes which are over the top, and the amazing Australian desert sort of settings. Fantastic. You can't go wrong, really. It's pure skiffy entertainment. And as I say, if you've not seen Prince of Darkness, come on. SF films from the late 60s until the sort of mid-70s, and then Star Wars came along and changed everything and changed it all for the worse. It infantilized everything, brought it all down to sort of fun and games. The films were dystopian and serious, and they were more like the literature, and they were better, and they were more powerful. I don't care what anybody says. You know, even the ones which didn't quite come up to bar. Look, if you take a film like The Ultimate Warrior, which I haven't seen for years, that was pretty bad. But, you know, at least there was a serious intent there. So we have two absolute classics. Rollerball, of course. Music conducted by Andre Previn. There's a couple of original pieces that he wrote, which are sort of jazzy synth and organ pieces called Executive Party and Executive Party Dance, and they're great. They've got some nice moog on them, some nice Hammond organ, sort of cheesy, and then of course it's got the wonderful Bach Toccata in D minor, played on the huge pump organ. Da, 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 da. Your classic Phantom of the Opera thing, brilliant. Of course, Rollerball, wonderful dystopian movie about freedom, a precursor of cyberpunk in its depiction of a corporate-run world. The very wonderful James Caan as Jonathan E. James Caan, who specialised in these wonderful portraits of the boiling emotions of inarticulate jocks. You know, that was his thing. He was great at that. This for me was his keynote role. Maud Adams, funny enough, we mentioned earlier on. John Houseman, who of course was in The Fog, as I say. Absolutely great. And Sport, the opium of the masses. What can you say? And that is interesting because the choice of music, they chose a lot of classical things. Shostakovich was chosen. He was the Soviet Union's official composer, you know, the official communist composer. And again, there was an invocation of what Kubrick did in Clockwork Orange, though. You choose classical pieces and you have a bit of synth stuff, and you merge the sort of classical and the modern together to try and get this idea across of a dystopian society which was cleaving towards certain traditional things, but at the same time having a new order that people were underneath. So it's kind of interesting. You have Silent Running, and I don't think I've ever played this LP. I bought it for its wonderful artwork, and it's got little bunnies there. And of course there's Huey, Dewey and Louie, the robots. It's on Vary Saraband, who did lots of soundtrack albums. And isn't that beautiful? Really lovely. Some stills on the back. And Silent Running is a wonderful, if flawed film, but it's got a good heart. You know, it's about environmentalism. And of course, you know, science fiction did environmentalism before anybody did. It was happening in the 50s with the space merchants, Paul and Kornbluth. Even before Rachel Carson wrote Silent Spring, you know, SF was already all over that stuff. And I'll just show it to you because, of course, it's on green vinyl. For some reason, a lot of these soundtracks are on green vinyl. I don't know why green seems to be the choice colour of the soundtrack LP. And, of course, it's got music on it by Joan Baez. I was never much of a folkie, though. She's got amazing voice, of course, and she's still around now. She looks incredible. You know, she's really knocking on. And she wrote that wonderful song, Diamonds and Rust, which is fantastic. And I like the cover version of it by Judas Priest, the heavy metal band. One of my favourite tracks of my youth. Got really good lyrics. It's all about her and Bob Dylan, I think. And I'm not a Dylanite either, I'll be the first to say. But yeah, but a great film. And the whole idea of taking Earth's remaining forests and putting them under geodesic domes in space, that was a strange one. And Bruce Dern, you know, your classic countercultural outsider. You know, he played a lot of flakes and weirdos. In this, he was a anti-heroic hero, and great stuff, you know. And you do love it. And there's the robots Huey, Dewey and Louie referencing the little ducks from Disney. Look at that, beautiful. They do not make them like that anymore, and that's the trouble. Two of my favourite films of all time by Dario Argento, one of my favourite directors of all time. For me, he's up there with Kubrick, Cronenberg and Leone. I mean, these are my favourite guys. And this LP here, gosh, I've had that a very long time. I bought that in the late 70s, mail order from Dress Circle, the shop I talked about earlier on, and that's the soundtrack of Suspiria, and music by Goblin. This is a little booklet from one of the sort of DVD or Blu-ray versions, which I've had several of over the years, and I obviously decided to sell something on and keep that, so I'll just pull that out. There's some ringwear on the sleeve. It's really seen a lot of action. And if you've never seen Suspiria, well, you know, there is a remake, but it is what it is. Suspiria is an amazing film. Incredible colours. It was shot on out-of-date film stock to get the colours really high. Indescribable music by Goblin, the prog rock band. And yeah, absolutely incredible. And yeah, if you've got sort of fake lobby cards in the back there as well. And I bought that late 70s after seeing Suspiria at an all-nighter at the Cardiff Odeon. And the lineup was, we sort of went in, me and my friend John, who I saw the other day, first time we'd seen each other for 30 years. He lives in the States. Hopefully I'll get over to see him sometime and shoot some adventures over there with him in Colorado. But yeah, we went in and it started at, I think, either 10 or 11. And the program was Suspiria, Ken Russell's The Devils, Larry Cohen's It's Alive, great exploitation SF film, and the very terrible Zoltan, Hound of Dracula. And we emerged bleary-eyed and blinking at 6 in the morning, and that would have been a Sunday morning in Cardiff because nothing was open then. You try and get a coffee and a donut 6 in the morning in the late 70s in Cardiff, it wasn't going to happen, and we had to wait till we could get the bus home. Yeah, great days, great adventures. But Suspiria, fantastic stuff. And there is a picture here of Goblin, if I can just filch out this lobby card. And Suspiria features Jessica Harper, the Iris turned the blue one, and it's a supernatural film about witches, and great stuff. Takes place at a dance academy in Germany, so if you've never seen it, you must. It's outrageous. And here's a picture of Goblin, and that's Massimo Morante, the guitarist, who died recently, as I say. Claudia Simonetti, who fronts a version of Goblin called Claudio Simonetti's Goblin. Funnily enough, I saw them back in 2014. And Fabio Pinatelli, the bass player, who is the only member of Goblin who's in every single lineup because they used to fall out all the time, and Marangolo, the drummer. Great stuff. And a wonderful LP. One of the best soundtracks of all time, utterly indescribable. Next to it is the soundtrack of a later Argento film called Tenebrae, which means darkness. Now that is on the That's Entertainment Records label, which is what Dress Circle became. Dress Circle, the shop, when they moved, they called themselves That's Entertainment, started their own label. And this is interesting because really this is a Goblin album, but it was credited to Simonetti, Pinatelli and Morante, rather like an ELP thing, like a prog thing, because they couldn't use the name Goblin because there was a different lineup then. And it's weird because Pinatelli was in the lineup of Goblin that was around then. They made an album called Volo, which is like a soft rock album with vocals on it. I really like it myself, I have to say. We play it in the car a lot. And Tenebrae is sort of drum machine driven, a lot of electronics, wonderful descending themes, vocoders, and it's basically the sort of most operatic slasher film you will ever see, with incredible set pieces, wonderful innovative photography, beautiful girls, and incredible architecture. Mostly shot in Turin, I think, Turin and Rome. He mostly shot in those two cities, and it's one of those films in which, you know, everybody dies. It's got a great plot to it. It doesn't essentially make a lot of sense, but it's a hell of a ride, and it's pinpoint perfect, marvelous. Tenebrae, Darkness. If you haven't seen it, run out and buy both of these on Blu-ray now. And we end with two old favourites right back to my real youth here, and of course 2001: A Space Odyssey. And that artwork, isn't it just absolutely stunning? And this isn't my original copy. This is a later copy. My original copy was given to me by my uncle, and he had it in his collection, and he'd gone to see it, and he gave me it in about, it must have been about 1970, and it was one of the things that got me interested in reading adult SF. I'd started to read things like Conan Doyle and Wells and Wyndham then, and it was just amazing because, of course, it's got the Zarathustra theme, it's got the Strauss waltzes, which I was familiar with because on TV at that time there was an ITV series which dramatised the lives of the Strauss brothers, and my mother was watching it and I got to see it, and she liked the music, so I knew that music. But it's also got really weird things like Ligeti with these strange choral, atonal things which are utterly bizarre, and of course the beautiful artwork. And interestingly, this is a gatefold. This is one of the original sort of pressings. Look at that artwork, isn't that lovely? And it shows a lot of the iconography that we're familiar with from the film. Absolutely beautiful. So I bought this probably about 20 years ago. About 20 years ago I went and on the internet a lot, and I rebought a lot of the LPs I had as a youth, which I then got rid of when CD came in. And I rebought them, and you could get things still sealed in their shrink wraps, mostly from the States, for really decent prices. And most of them I got for sort of 10 to 15 pounds max, and the postage was cheaper then. So I got this then, and this has got the sort of paste down center which you see on older albums from the 60s and what have you, and absolutely beautiful. So that is the original gatefold version of 2001: A Space Odyssey. Absolutely gorgeous. You can't really say any more about than that. It's got the wheel, Pan Am. Oh, it's just bliss, isn't it? I find it a difficult film to watch these days. I do love Kubrick, but I do think it's too long. I think the sequence with Hal could have been cut a bit. It does lack a little suspense, but in terms of it pushing things forward, in terms of sophistication, how things looked in SF, you know, it was absolutely a landmark, as we all agree. And the trip sequence, absolutely fantastic. We loved it. And it was the coldness of it. It was that sort of thing where he managed to sum up that distance thing you get in hard S, where people's hard SF, where people's feelings are not the point. The point is the kind of the cosmic experience, and marvelous stuff. Next to that, we have something far more absurd, which bizarrely is allied to New Wave SF, because J.G. Ballard wrote the screen treatment for this film, When Dinosaurs Ruled the Earth. And When Dinosaurs Ruled the Earth was the quasi-sequel to 1 Million Years BC. Of course, it wasn't a sequel, it was just the same story again. Basically had Victoria Vetri in it instead of Raquel Welch. It was made on the cheap Jim Danforth did the stop frame. It was a little bit more kid oriented, and yet there is a sequence, there's a nude sequence in it, which I saw at the cinema when I was a child and was edited out on TV for a long time. They got Nassim Bene in again, Italian, to do the music, which again is very percussive and clunky and strange. And obviously they couldn't afford Morricone. They sort of liked him. And what you'll see down here is also featuring Creatures the World Forgot. And this is a gatefold LP again. We're ending with a couple of gatefolds. And there you go. Isn't that lovely? Isn't that great? And Creatures the World Forgot, which doesn't have any stop frame in it. And that's it. And that was issued on Blu-ray recently in a really nice limited edition, which I got. And it's not a great film, but it does have that sort of charm. It's got Julie Edge in it. Julie Edge was Scandinavian. I think she was from Sweden, and she's very briefly in the film of The Final Programme, the Jerry Cornelius film by Robert Fuest, based on the wonderful novel by Michael Moorcock. And as I say, Ballard wrote the screen treatment for When Dinosaurs Rule the Earth. And on the sort of credits, it's got... He spells his name incorrectly. It says J.B. Ballard. It says something like that. He wasn't very happy about it. And probably Moorcock used to rib him about it, say, you know, that was great, J.G., you know. And then, of course, Moorcock's own shame was ahead with The Land That Time Forgot, you know, which is a really terrible film, but there you go. But funny enough, Creatures the World Forgot, I wanted to see it for years. It was a Hammer film I couldn't get to see, and it was the early 90s it would have been. And it was a Saturday night, and I was out with some friends and the video widow. And I think we had some friends staying from Wales, and we went to the pub, and then I think they went to a club. And I came home early, and I said, I'll see you later, because Creatures the World Forgot was showing on TV, and I wanted to see it. And I came home to see it, and I was taping it, but I wanted to see it because I'd always really wanted to see it. So I was watching it, and halfway through, they stopped showing it because the Gulf War started. The Gulf War prevented my enjoyment of a schlocky Hammer film. What can you say? First world problems. So there's a look at some soundtrack LPs, the glorious iconography of vinyl, and how, you know, cinema is a wonderful thing, you know, as in terms of collaborative art, you can't fault it really, and you forget how important music is. And as I say, going back to the days before VHS, before home video of any kind, before Blu-ray, DVD, what have you, streaming, we're really spoilt now, aren't we? You know, listening to the music, looking at the album cover, reading the tie-in novel or the source novel when you couldn't see the film or couldn't get to see the film easily because it had its cinematic run, you were too young to get in to see it, it hadn't been on TV yet. You know, that was really quite something magical and something we're forgetting. So this is Outlaw Bookseller. Hope you enjoyed that. Bit different, I know. Signing out for now.